Jobs and social justice. You want a ladder to the middle class? Support public transit. When we think of public transit, we often think of it as a service, something that should be provided efficiently and effectively at the lowest cost possible. But in fact, public transit is a civil right. This means that people are not only privileged to be able to ride a train or a bus, but in fact have the right to mobility. This is not only a political or ideological belief, but it's also crafted into law in the United States. But before we get there, we're going to look briefly at some context from civil rights leaders. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in his A Testament of Hope, written in January 1969, said, "Urban transit systems in most American cities have become a genuine civil rights issue because the layout of rapid transit systems determines the accessibility of jobs. If transportation systems in American cities could be laid out so as to provide an opportunity for poor people to get to meaningful employment, then they could begin to move into the mainstream of life." As Dr. King saw, ATU has long argued that the way we plan and execute and operate our transit systems has an incredible impact, especially in urban communities, on African Americans, on immigrant communities, on Latino communities especially, and across the board on low-income communities. We can look at cities like Washington or New York and DC, and if you overlay maps of transit systems with maps of per capita income or household income or accessibility to job centers, you'll regularly see that where transit does not exist, people either are high income and can afford car commuting or are incredibly low income and isolated from opportunity. To address this, in 1964, the passage of the Civil Rights Act included Title VI. Title VI forbids discrimination in federally assisted programs. This includes public transportation. While this right has existed on the books for many years, decades in fact, few have actually invoked it to try to change the way public transit systems are developed. But in 1996, the Los Angeles Bus Riders Union won a landmark civil rights lawsuit brought under Title VI against the Los Angeles MTA. The case was brought by the BRU and the NAACP's Legal Defense and Education Fund to challenge racial discrimination in the transportation policies of the MTA. The suit charged that the MTA was violating Title VI by establishing a more discriminatory, separate, and unequal transit system while using federal funds. A similar case is underway in Baltimore, Maryland, where Local 1300 of ATU is supporting the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund and other plaintiffs who are arguing that the MTA in Maryland's elimination of the Red Line, which would have connected Baltimore's east and west sides by rail for the first time ever, the decision by the MTA to eliminate the Red Line, in fact, violates the civil rights of many Baltimore riders. So this is not limited to just one case in the 1990s. Also, income inequality is more rampant than ever in the United States. In the United States, Americans are finding it increasingly difficult to find well-paying jobs, to support their families, and to enter the ever-shrinking middle class. Half of Americans, in fact, are considered poor or low income. Transit has a role to play in this. Looking a little deeper at the numbers, we'll find that the average income per family of the top 0.01%, again, that's not the top 1%, that's the top 0.01%. The average income per family is $23,846,950. This is from 2010, almost 7 years ago. This number has only increased. The top 0.01 to 0.1%, so we're still not even in the top 1%, just the top sliver, that family income averages $2.8 million a year. When we finally get to the top 1%, we see an average household or average income per family of $1 million a year. Let's look at the rest of the country, most people. The top 1 to 10%, these may be middle managers or bosses at local transit systems or general managers, they tend to make around $160,000 per year as a family. Whereas most of the workforce, this is public transit bus operators, this is public transit rail operators, this is maintenance and service staff, are living somewhere in the bottom 90%, where the average income per family is less than $30,000 a year. Currently, transit workers tend to be on the top of that bottom 90%, but that safety is increasingly eroding as attacks on union rights and attacks on publicly funded transit, and ultimately the push for privatization erode our economic stability. But the good news is that investment in transit helps close that income gap. The American working class spends the vast majority of its income on two things: housing and transportation. This is especially true in growing urban centers that are facing gentrification, where a bubble in real estate prices has created rents soaring between $2,000 and $3,000 for small 1 or 2 bedroom apartments. Transportation costs in most cities are only rising. As it gets harder to fund transit, local and regional agencies spend more time and energy trying to extract the cost of transit from riders or workers. This in the form of pension or wage cuts or fare increases or service cuts. In fact, only 30% of jobs in U.S. metropolitan cities are accessible via 90-minute or less commutes. Again, that's 30% of jobs you can get to in less than 90 minutes. The income gap will only be closed if the working poor in the United States and Canada have access to education and good jobs. Transit provides this access in an affordable way. However, low-income workers in suburban areas are forced to use a car, as robust public transit often does not exist. The ATU would argue that as demographics change, as people move from the cities to the suburbs or vice versa, that local government has to invest in transit-accessible urban cores while increasing transit service to get people of all incomes to work. Too often today, we see new investments in transit focused on upscaling, redeveloping, revitalizing, pick your word, a neighborhood, instead of expanding transit to places that don't have any. The result has been high prices, gentrification, the pushing out of longtime residents, while those who live in transit deserts remain in transit deserts. In some cases, in fact, the population of those deserts increases as people move out of areas where a new streetcar has helped raise real estate prices and into neighborhoods where transit has always been a problem. That only taxes the transit system more. In terms of investing in public transit, it not only helps reduce the income gap or increase the connection between job centers and neighborhoods, it also leads to more savings on an individual and family basis. A recent study estimated that 75% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. When transit is a viable option, it allows these working families to forego purchasing an additional car or maybe even living without a car. As we saw in previous trainings, car ownership is one of the most expensive things that an American can do, and transportation costs are one of the top 2 highest costs for Americans. Giving people the option to eliminate the cost of a car or move from a 2-car to a 1-car household or ride the bus to work significantly increases their ability to save money in the long term. Public transit also leads to a higher quality of life. If jobs are located near housing centers and public transit facilities, it can also mean more time outside of work and outside of commuting spent with family. A recent study found a correlation between cities with lower car ownership levels and higher education levels. In short, the more a person can walk to work, the more a person can walk after work to pick up their kid from school, the less time they have to spend in a car or the less time they have to spend in traffic, the higher quality of life a person has. So in the end, public transit is not just a civil rights issue. It's an economic issue. It's an issue of family life. It's an issue of quality of life. And if we care about jobs and social justice, we should be supporting public transit to help deliver those two things.